All right, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Audrey Rindlisbacher, the author of The Mission Driven Life and the founder of The Mission Driven Mom. I'm so glad that you're joining me today. We're going to do something fun and talk about William Penn in a mission driven story. And we'll get to that in just a minute. If you are new to the show, go right ahead and keep listening to recent issues, but you might want to go back to the beginning of this podcast series and listen from the beginning. There is information in depth about the seven laws of life mission and why we do what we do here that might be helpful for you to get that information and have a better grasp on what we do. Of course, you'll want to head over to themissiondrivenmom.com and grab your copy of the audio book for free of The Mission Driven Life. That is an in-depth look at those seven laws of life mission, how the Ten Boom family lived them, and how they can revolutionize your life and help you to discover and fulfill your own unique contributions to the world. I don't know how much longer that audiobook will be available for free over there, so make sure you head over there and grab it quickly. And in conjunction with that, I wanted to answer the question, why do I do these mission-driven stories in the first place? There's quite a few of them. If you look over the history of this podcast, you'll see quite a few of them. Today, we're going to spend some time with William Penn, who is way more amazing than I thought he was. It was such a joy to learn about him. The reason we do these mission-driven stories is there's a few reasons. First of all, hopefully it gives you a little better insight into those seven laws. You can understand them a little bit better as you see them enacted and lived out by these great men and women. Another reason is because it demonstrates the effectiveness of those seven laws. It shows the veracity of them. It demonstrates to all of us that those who have had the most positive impact in the world did indeed live these seven laws and went back to the foundational laws as they were leaders in their homes and communities and sometimes in the world. The more mission-driven stories we hear, the more faith we can have in their ability to give us a solid foundation and put us on the path of mission. And we can know that just like these other men and women who had their own struggles when they were young, we can become a little bit like them. And another reason for doing the mission-driven stories is just to inspire you so that you and I can spend time with some of the best people who have ever lived and let their goodness and nobility rub off on us. We can become a little bit like them by spending time with them. And it's just inspiring. It puts our lives and our sacrifices in some way better context when we see what other people have gone through. I've said this often, but for many years after reading The Hiding Place for the first time, I would climb into bed each night and genuinely feel grateful that I was not in a concentration camp like Corey and Betsy were, the 10 booms that I talk about in my book, The Mission Driven Life. And that humbled me and it made me grateful and it kept them at the top of my awareness because I really wanted to be like them. And one of the things I point out in the book is that they were really my idols. I really wanted to become like them. And then as I read Corey's other books, I came to see that they weren't always the incredible people. They were always incredible in their goodness and their wholesomeness. But they had a lot of problems they had to overcome, just like I have a lot of problems. And you probably do too. Maybe you have problems like I did and the 10 booms did in your marriage or with your finances or with your health. Maybe your confidence is low. You don't know what gifts and talents you have. Maybe you aren't sure what next steps to take for yourself. Maybe you're just struggling to get out of bed in the morning because the day doesn't sound exciting and you don't know how to find deeper purpose for yourself. Those are all things that we address here at the Mission Driven Mom. On this podcast, in these mission driven stories, I talk about that in the Mission Driven Life. And of course, in the Academy, we walk you through how to get out of that funk and onto a life where you thrive and develop and grow. So let's dive into William Penn today. I guess I knew that he was the founder of Pennsylvania, and I'm not sure if I knew much more beyond that. So we're going to dive in because it's an incredible story. He was born in 1644 in England. And if you know anything about the 1600s in England, they were not pretty. There was almost perpetual ongoing religious persecution as leadership changed through Cromwell and kings and deaths. Whatever the religious affiliation of the prominent leader was, would be what was supported, and everybody else would get persecuted. And then they would make promises about how they weren't going to persecute, but then they would do it anyway and not honor their promises. And so this is the environment. It's really just ramping up. It all gets started just as William is starting to grow up. When he was 3 years old, he contracted smallpox, which actually turned out to be a blessing later in life, but it made him bald. He survived, but he was bald. By the time he was in adulthood, he had a full head of hair again, but all through his childhood, he wore wigs because he was bald. And when he was 4, this religious upheaval really took a new turn when Cromwell took over. He executed King Charles, and all of this social unrest began to happen. He sent troops to Ireland to suppress them and started taking over there. Really, really so sad. Now, in the meantime, William's father was a really high up Navy general. In fact, by the time William was little, his father was like second in command in the Royal Navy. And because of all of his service, he was granted an estate, a castle, which is called Macroom Castle, that you can actually go see pictures online. It's really cool. And the land around it, this estate was granted to his father in gratitude for all that he did for England. So he's in this family that's well known. His father knows the king, and they do well financially because not only does he have this really nice income from being a naval officer, he also was granted these additional lands. And if he played his cards right, he could extract rent money from the people on that estate. So things were going well for William's father when William was young. And he sent him to a school called Chigwell School. It wasn't too far from his home. It was a few miles, and William would run there. What's crazy is that he started about age 5, and school began at 6 a.m. These little kids had an incredibly long day. He did catechism and prayers, and then listen to this. He learned Greek and English literature, English grammar, Latin spelling, and moral training well into the afternoon. But he was a smart kid, so that was good for him. School wasn't incredibly difficult for him, and his intelligence always was a blessing for him. Now, as time went on and William got a little bit older, 9, 10, 11 years old, Cromwell sent his dad off on a mission to do something, and he didn't do it the way Cromwell wanted him to. So when his dad came back in town, Cromwell imprisoned him in the Tower of London. And he kept him there for a little while because he was just so mad at him. But in the end, he couldn't find something legitimate to charge him with, so he had to let his father out of prison. Well, of course, this totally disgraced his father and his family. His father wanted to get out of there, and he had this estate in Ireland. So he took his family when William was 11. They went up to this estate. He brought a bunch of his people with him. He got everything organized, and his father told William that there wasn't a good enough school for William to attend. So William didn't get to go to school for the next 4 years while they were in Ireland, but he helped his father run the estate. He went off and did what they called man's work, and so he learned how to do it. And he didn't like the way his father treated people. His father was a very rough, hard man. He'd been at sea since he was young. I can't remember, 8, 9, 10 years old. He'd had his own ship when he was 17. And he'd been at war a lot. And this is why when this particular experience happened, which I'm about to tell you about, really blew William's mind. He would have never expected this of his dad. So one day they're living in Ireland and they hear about this Quaker. The Quaker religion was pretty new. George Fox was its founder, was just maybe a couple decades old at this point. It was growing slow throughout England and in other places in the world. And William's father found out that this William preacher was going through the area. And William was shocked to hear his father say, "If you see him, tell him I welcome him here, and he can hold a meeting in the house if he wants to. There's plenty of food and room for him because we shouldn't judge him." Basically, he's like, "I've been judged harshly and it wasn't fair, and I don't want to judge other people. So I want to hear what he has to say." So this preacher comes to the house and spends some time with them, and he gives a sermon to the household. And it is so beautiful and so moving that it actually brings William to tears. And when he looks over at his father is actually crying. It's the only time he ever saw his father cry, as far as we know. In fact, I want to read you a little bit the kinds of things that his name was Thomas Lowe, this Quaker preacher, kinds of things that he preached to the Penn family that had such a big influence on them. He says, this is from one of his tracts. True religion is not a matter of outward observances. Rather, it takes place within the heart. It is not rooted in past events in a far off land, but in the true inner light that shone then and continues to shine today. Men must follow this inner light until it illuminates their heart and they experience a closeness of God there. No other man, no priest or clergyman can mediate this. Each man, in the quiet of his heart, must come to his own reckoning with God. For the scriptures tell us that man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at a man's heart. So that was the message, part of the message that he shared, and it really touched the Penn family and stayed with William. They didn't convert or anything, but he remembered this experience very fondly, and it made him think more about his spiritual life, about his relationship with God, about the kind of man he wanted to grow up to be. And he became more conscientious and intentional that way. After 4 years, Cromwell and his son were both dead, and the country was wanting their nobility back. And so they were trying to get Prince Charles back into England and crown him king. They made him make a bunch of promises about things that he would do if they made him king, which of course he agreed to and then later broke those promises. Surprise, surprise. In the meantime, because of all the things that William's father had done for Charles's father when his father was king before he was executed, Charles knighted Admiral Penn, and then his family became part of the nobility. And in fact, William's father and William were close to James, Charles's brother, from the time William was young, and that relationship made a difference for him later on. So they come home. William's 15, 16 years old, and he's sent off to Oxford, which he's really delighted about. But Oxford, like so many other places in England at the time, had been a battleground for the internal strife that had gone on. When Cromwell took over, he replaced the headmaster, and that headmaster was a Puritan, and the Puritans had gotten rid of all the sports and all of the group events and tightened things up really tight. And then when Prince Charles came back into power, then he changed things back. And so then the people in power were upset with the other people in power. One of those people had been Dr. Owens. And so going to Dr. Owens' house was off limits. William watched some of his fellow students beat a Quaker at one point because of his religious beliefs. And William had this beautiful experience with the Quakers, and he knew what kind of people they were, and that really disturbed him. And so, because of that, he distanced himself from some of the mainstream students and befriended some Puritans. And that got him into some trouble and made him unpopular. Then he went and spent time at Dr. Owen's home, having some really in-depth discussions about religion and about philosophy and about government and all of the things that were really on William's heart and in his mind that he was thinking about and trying to get clear about. And eventually, because of the acquaintances that he had, the relationships and the friendships that he was building, he didn't want to wear one particular piece of religious clothing, and he didn't want to go to some of the daily religious meetings. And he was given a few warnings, and when he didn't comply, he was expelled from Oxford. When he got home, his father was outraged and beat him really severely. It took him a little while to heal, and then his parents put their heads together and consulted and tried to figure out what they were going to do with him. And they decided, okay, it's a popular thing to send rich or well-off young men to what they called the continent or Europe, over to France and other countries over there, and to have them do a European tour. So William went off. He was about 18 at this point, and he was given letters of introduction to different dignitaries. So he met some of the biggest people around at the time. He fell in love with beautiful and good clothing, and he had an okay time. He learned French, but he really didn't love it there. He longed for the kinds of discussions he'd had at Oxford with Dr. Owens or with Thomas Lowe, the Quaker preacher. The really great thing for him was that he met a man named Moses Amiro. He was a famous French theologian, and he found out that this professor, Amiro, taught at the Protestant school. And so he enrolled. And for not quite a year, maybe, he was part of this school. He was learning, he was growing, he was having these incredible conversations. He was tutored by Moses Amiro. And then he suddenly died. And so by the time that next spring, when Amiro had died and school let out, he decided that it was time to go home. But by now, he had strong logical reasons for following his conscience. And based on the experiences that he'd had with the Quakers and the Puritans and at this Protestant school and with this mentor, Moses, he made a promise to himself that he would follow his conscience from then on. And like I've said in past podcasts, I could give you pretty much almost everyone I've ever studied who really did important, good things in the world made this commitment to follow their conscience. It really is so important. Well, his father knew that he loved to discuss things. And at this point, it's okay, he's back. What do I do with them? And he decides to have him go to Lincoln's Inn and study law. For about a year, he studies law until he's 20 or so. And right about that time, the plague broke out. And this was the terrible plague. We don't know exact numbers. We know that it killed a significant portion of the population of London at the time and into the surrounding areas. Sometimes up to 6,000 people per week died, and they just couldn't keep up with it. In fact, I read one place where they would sometimes board up the houses of people who were found to have the plague in their home. And then those people couldn't get access to food and water. And sometimes they'd die of starvation rather than of the plague because they were just trying to keep it at bay. And they would knock on doors and drag the dead bodies out to get the dead bodies out of the city. Just such a terrible time. And of course, William's school let out. There was nobody around. He went home, which his home was a little ways out of town, and luckily their family escaped the plague. But one of the most important things that happened to William during this time is watching the Quakers during the plague. So he noticed that at the risk of their own lives, they were going house to house and bringing food, especially to these homes that had been boarded up. They were helping to remove the bodies. And not only were they risking their lives because they could get the plague and die of it, but also they were persecuted and made fun of for the service that they rendered. But they just ignored all of the taunts and they went about doing good. And it made such a huge impression on him. He said that Moses taught him that piety is not enough. Morality dictates that a man must take responsibility to help his brother. And that is what he saw the Quakers doing. So he's home now. The plague is still raging. He's turned 21, and his father is not sure what to do with him. But now he legally can represent his father. So he sends him right back to Ireland. And he doesn't get along with his father really well. So William is happy to go. He heads up there. He gets everything in order. While he's in Ireland, there's a huge fire that sweeps through London. It brings the plague to an end, which is great, but it destroys, some say, up to 2/3 of the buildings in the city. It raged for 3 or 4 days. And just the houses were really close together and they were made of wood, and it just destroyed so many things. So he's up in Ireland. He's running his father's estate for him. And at one point, he's trying to find a good tailor because he likes nice clothing. And he stumbles on this little shop and he starts into this conversation with this woman who's dressed really plainly. And it comes up that she's a Quaker. And he mentions that he heard a Quaker preacher once named Thomas Lowe. And at first, she's just shocked. She doesn't believe him. She's like, no, that's not. He's like, no, really. He's like, okay, what did he say? And he told her some of the things that this preacher said. And she's like, okay, then do you want to come to this secret meeting? Because there's persecution of Quakers in Ireland as well. So they have to hold their meetings secretly. And she says, this Thomas Lowe man is here and he's going to he's going to run this meeting. Do you want to come? And William's like, yeah, absolutely. So he goes to this meeting and he hears Thomas Lowe preach again. And it brings him to tears again. It just touches him at the most tender parts of his heart. And it speaks to all of the things that he's been learning. He's even more prepared to hear a message of obeying conscience and being true to what's best in you and living out your religion in the way that you live. He stays late into the night and talks to Thomas. And he could see that one of the ways that he put it was that real faith is about love and peace and following the light of conscience illuminated by Jesus Christ. So not long after that, he attends another meeting and a soldier knocks on the door and comes in. And he sees that it's a Quaker meeting and he wants to arrest everybody. And William is not a declared Quaker yet. And he's a big, strong man. He's super mad that this man is interrupting this beautiful religious meeting that they're having. So he grabs this man and he drags him over to the staircase and he's ready to throw him down the stairs. The Quakers beg him, stop, stop, stop. We are pacifists. We don't do this. This isn't how we function. Please let this man go. So he honors them and lets the man go and he runs off. And William's like, they're going to be back. They know what they're doing. They're like, we know. So they come back, he brings more people with him, and they arrest everyone. Then they go before the judge, and the judge realizes that he has basically a nobleman among these Quakers. William Penn is the big man around town, and he has this estate. And so the judge is, you can go home. You don't need to stay. You haven't done anything wrong. And in that moment, when he's faced with being set free, he decides to listen to his conscience yet again and confess his faith. He says, nope, I'm staying here. I'm a Quaker too. So he becomes one of them in that moment. And they're all in prison. And of course, he has all this legal training and these really incredible education that he's been able to obtain. So he pushes them to declare by what law they're imprisoned, et cetera, and he gets them released. Of course, his legal training and his education came to the aid of the Quakers countless times, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. When his dad finds out that he's declared himself a Quaker, he is livid. He sends for William, tells William to come home. And William brings another Quaker with him. And when they first get there that first night, he brings him in to meet his father. And he keeps that man by his side because he knows his father might beat him again. And he doesn't want to fight back with his dad. He's a big, strong man now. But anyway, he wants to be respectful. So his dad doesn't beat him. The next day, they go on a carriage ride and they go to an inn. And his father takes him to an upstairs room. And he says, basically, what you're doing is absolutely ridiculous and you are disgracing me and you have got to stop. If you continue in this manner, not even I, with all my contacts, will be able to protect you from the consequences. In fact, if I suppose you will lose your life and I my career for raising such a son as you. So we don't know exactly what he said, but it was something right along those lines that he was risking his own life. He was risking his father's career and the livelihood of the family. But William wouldn't budge. So then his dad is like, okay, well, I'm going to pray that God makes you not a Quaker anymore. And he's, Dad, don't say that prayer. Don't say that prayer. And then someone knocks on the door and the conference ends and they just leave it there. But over the next little while, his father keeps telling him, you have to give it up. You can't be a Quaker and be my son. And William will not relent. He won't give up his faith. And so his father throws him out of the house and tells him he's going to remove him from his will. So now here's William. He's 24 years old and he's penniless and homeless. He takes refuge with the Quakers and he realizes something as he spends time with them. He realizes that their founder, George Fox, is a really eloquent speaker, but he never had a very good education. And so he's not a very good writer. And William decides that it's going to be his job to defend the faith. So he starts writing essays and pamphlets, and he finds an underground printer to print what he's written. And He's caught and he's imprisoned. He's locked up in a room alone, and he's not allowed to have visitors or books. And he's told that he must recant or spend the rest of his life in prison. And we have his words because they were written down, what he was saying. So his father sent this message. His father was petitioning for him, and this was the requirement that the king and the powers that be had placed on him, that he had to recant or spend his life in prison. This is what William Penn said back at age 24. It's so incredible. Thou mayest tell my father, whom I know will ask thee, these words, that my prison shall be my grave, before I will budge a jot. For I owe my conscience to no mortal man. I have no need to fear. God will make amends for all. So he is ready to die for his faith and for his conscience, and he knows he may spend the rest of his life in prison. A little while after this, he's actually given the ability to write. He's given some pen and paper, and he starts writing. This is what one author said about how incredible he was. With only the aid of his memory, he quoted 64 different authors, from Socrates to Martin Luther, and 400 passages from the Bible in another essay about Quaker beliefs. He called this essay No Cross, No Crown, and promised himself that he would find a way to smuggle it out of the tower. And you can find that. You can put in No Cross, No Crown by William Penn, and you can find that essay online. We still have that. We have a lot of his writings, actually. He wrote a lot of essays. But eventually, he was let go. It was not good form for someone as high up as William Penn's father, knighted, a nobleman, to have this son sitting in prison. And so they finally let him out. But the condition was that his father was responsible for him for 1 year. So guess what his father did? You're right. Sent him back to Ireland. So he goes back to Ireland to manage the estate there again. And on the way, he stays a couple nights with a Quaker family because he knows a lot of Quakers, obviously, at this point, and they have connections with each other and they help each other out. And he stays in this home and he meets his future wife. They really hit it off. She's an incredible woman and she's really well educated. When not all women were educated at this point, even among the upper class. This woman was, and they made a connection. They fell very much in love over time, although they did not marry for another, I think, 3 or 4 years. So while he was in Ireland, he's running the estate, but he also gives himself the job of trying to petition for Quakers, especially those that had been imprisoned. So he goes to the rich, influential people around Ireland and he asks for funds. He asks them to use their influence with people in power to get these prisoners released. He's there for a while, and finally, when things are under control and he's bid his time, he decides he wants to go back to England. Once he's returned, he hasn't been there long, and he leads a prayer meeting on a street corner. So, of course, he's publicly seen, and he's arrested again. Now, he goes to prison many times in his life. I'm not going to go through them all, but this particular imprisonment had a really fascinating ending. He's asked if he wants to plead guilty or not guilty. And he replies by asking them if he's going to have a fair trial. And they say, yeah, for sure. We're going to give you a fair trial. And he's like, okay, if I'm going to get a fair trial, then I'll go to trial. So he goes to trial and he proves that he wasn't breaking the law, that they can't come up with any law that proves that he was doing something wrong. And it's such an interesting story because the judge wanted him to go to prison. The judge wanted to persecute him for his religious beliefs, but the jury refused to find him guilty. The judge kept guiding the jury and telling them, no, 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 you need to find him guilty. And they wouldn't. So finally he got mad at the jury and he sent William and his friend that was also there on trial and all the jurymen to prison overnight. And then he brings him back the next day and he's like, okay, now let's hear all the stuff again. And I need you to give me a different ruling. And so they give him a different ruling, but it's just a different way of wording that William Penn is not guilty. And so he threatens them again and he sends them to jail again. And he does this a few times and then he finally fines them a pretty good amount of money. and sends them all to prison. Over a few days, this happens. And so they're all sitting in prison together under this fine that they can't pay. Well, eventually, William's father pays the fine for him and his friend, and they get out of prison. And he's summoned to his father, and he finds his father on his deathbed. In the meantime, these jurors who would not listen to the judge, but were finding him not guilty according to their own consciences and the evidence they were presented, were eventually let out of prison. And when they turned right around and sued this judge, and that went to court, and they found the judge guilty of obstructing justice. And this became a really great precedent in England for fair trials and holding the judges to the law and independent juries. So when those juries made a ruling, the judge couldn't force their hand, which was just so incredible to continue to expand freedom. William, in the meantime, is at his father's bedside where he's dying. And he says these words to William, which really surprised him again. Let nothing in this world tempt you to wrong your conscience. I charge you, do nothing against your conscience. So will you keep peace at home, which will be a feast to you in a day of trouble. And it turned out that his father had not taken him out of his will. I don't know if he'd taken him out and put him back in, but when he died, William was actually the inheritor of his father's estates, and he was instantly a pretty rich man. But all of his nobleness and his wealth and his position in society and his friendship with James, none of that was enough to keep him out of prison again. Just 5 months after his father died, he had led a Quaker meeting at a home in London and was imprisoned again and sentenced to 6 months. He was glad to have the sentencing because then at least he knew when it would be over. But he was in prison with a lot of other people, and I won't describe them to you, but the conditions were pretty bad. It was a pretty miserable place to be, but he took solace in his fellow prisoners and they treated each other well. He put pen to paper again and wrote what I think is maybe his greatest writing ever. It's called The Great Case for Liberty of Conscience. And I'm going to tell you at the end of this podcast the incredible impact that this pamphlet and his life and legacy had on you and me today. We owe him so much. So this was in 1670. He was 26 years old. So amazing, the caliber of man that he was. And I want to read you some of the arguments that he made in this tract, that forcing religious conformity is counterproductive and undermines divine authority, civil government, and true religion. So here's a few of the points. Religious coercion dishonors God. Only God can rule the conscience, and forced worship is an abomination. Penn argued that true faith must be voluntary and come from internal conviction, not from external pressure. Attempting to force belief discredits genuine meekness and power of the Christian religion itself. Here's another one. Persecution has never worked to establish true religion. He argued that throughout history, forced conformity has failed to create genuine piety and has led to hypocrisy, bitterness, and civil strife. He cited historical examples. Again, this is in prison when he has no notes and no books, but he's thought about this so much, and it's part of who he really is, that he's able to make these arguments beautifully. He demonstrated that forcing the conscience does not work and is an illegitimate method for promoting faith. 3, coercion violates reason and natural rights. He used the natural law, which of course we talk about all the time at the Mission Driven Mom. He used the natural law and common reason to prove that individuals have a right to liberty of conscience. So it wasn't just that it didn't work, and it wasn't just that it dishonored God, it was that we also have a natural right. Penn argued that it is irrational and against the basic principles of humanity to punish people for their private beliefs that do not disturb the civil peace. 4, freedom of conscience benefits civil society. He contended that societies are more prosperous and stable when they're tolerant and peaceful, and he used the prosperity of Holland, which practiced religious tolerance, as a practical example. Persecution, in contrast, creates discord and weakens the government. He believed that a good government depends on good people, and people flourish under liberty of conscience. And just to be clear, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, He believed that everyone should believe in God. If you wanted to have the right to vote, you needed to declare some kind of belief in a higher being because that would hold you accountable. That's where your conscience would come from. And so it wasn't that there was no religion at all, although we have taken these same arguments that he is making and taken them all the way to protect atheism and beyond, right? Like these are the seeds of that, of some of those things. Anyway, number 5, persecution violates scriptural authority. Penn used scripture to support his case, emphasizing the distinction between God's spiritual government and civil authority, of course, using Jesus's teaching, render to things Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Penn argued that earthly rulers have no authority over the private conscience. So he argued that coercion discredits all these things: the honor of God, the meekness of the Christian religion, the authority of Scripture, the privileges of nature and natural law, the principles of common reason, the well being of government and society, and the teaching of wise men in historical and modern times. That's a lot of really great arguments. One early historian called Penn's treatise, quote, the completest exposition of the theory of toleration at the time. So just incredible. By the way, just as a side note for those who are familiar with these names, William Penn met John Locke when he was on his European tour, and he was friends with John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress in prison around the time of these events. So pretty incredible. Finally, in 1672, he married Gulielma Springett, and he hoped that he would have more peaceful times. But sadly, that did not happen. His life was so full of trials. They had a baby girl just a year after they were married. She died 7 weeks later. In fact, I won't go through the whole history, but just so you know, William ended up having 2 wives because his first wife died. Between his 2 wives, he had 13 children, and 11 of them died during his lifetime. Most of them in childhood, but a couple of them when they were older. So much heartache in William's life. 2 months after his first baby died, his brother also died. The hard things happening, but he and his wife love each other. They have some financial independence, and so he spends almost all his time helping the Quakers. It's the call he feels from God. It's the mission that he's on. He's out there. Sometimes he's traveling to foreign countries for several months at a time, up to 7 months or more, helping Quakers wherever they need help with his resources, his legal training, his education, his eloquence, his pen, whatever he can do to help them. And he's told by his financial advisor that funds are starting to run low. And so he actually scales back. Instead of stopping that work, he lives in a more modest home so that he can keep doing the work for the Quakers. Now, of course, all the civil unrest and religious persecution is happening in England. I won't get into all of that. You can look up the history, but it's pretty miserable. And from one day to the next, somebody might be in charge that won't like what you believe, whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant or a Quaker or a Puritan. There's going to be somebody in power that doesn't like one of those or multiple of those sects. And so you're going to be in trouble. And he's just done. He's just sick of it. And he decides if he can get himself his own tract of land in America, if the king would give him that, then he could have his own little plot and have religious freedom for the first time in his life. And what he really wants to do is he wants to provide a place in America where his fellow Quakers and others under religious persecution can escape to. That's really the dream that he develops. I've been fighting here for years. Let's just go build a safe place where we can all just live together in peace. So something really miraculous and crazy happens. He puts in this petition to the king for a tract of land. He wants some between Maryland and New Jersey. And to his utter shock, and really everybody else's utter shock, the king, partially to repay an old debt that he owed William's father, gave William the biggest charter of all time. It was 45,000 square miles. And to give you some kind of idea of what that means, it's almost 29 million acres. It made him the largest private landholder in the world. So it just incredibly crazy. I don't know if he felt like that's what he had to do to discharge the debt, or he really trusted William Penn and his intentions and wanted to support his intentions. We don't know all the reasons why he did that, but he did, and it was a miracle. And it created, of course, Pennsylvania. Just incredible. I want to tell you there's three things that he did as soon as he was given. In fact, he was given this tract of land like within a few days, like it happened overnight. He had already been thinking about this a lot. He called it his holy experiment. And for him, it was 100% driven by his love for God and his desire to have increased freedom for as many people as possible. I just think it's so beautiful that with that pure intention, God granted him such a huge tract of land where he could live out this dream that was such a blessing to so many people. He needs to name it, and he wants to name it Sylvania, which means forest, because it was pretty forested. He had reports about it. But King Charles wanted him to use the name Penn. And that just wasn't a Quaker thing to do. He just wasn't going to name things after himself. And finally, the king talks him into it by telling him he should name it after your father, Sir William Penn. So for William Penn, in his own mind, it was actually named for his father. They put the Penn at the beginning. It was called Pennsylvania. And he was given complete freedom to do whatever he wanted with it. They gave him complete license. They trusted him implicitly to do whatever he wanted with it. He was 36 years old. Isn't that incredible? And he spent the rest of his life, I think I know he lived another 30 plus years. I can't remember exactly how old he was when he died. And really, Pennsylvania was a great blessing and gift to the world. But for William Penn, it was mostly just a source of so much trial and struggle. And he just fought and fought and fought the rest of his life to make Pennsylvania what he envisioned it to be. Well, the first thing he did was write 3 letters. And I just think that this speaks to the depth of his character and intention. This is the first thing he did was write these letters. First, he wrote to Robert Turner. He was an old Quaker friend. And this is what he said in the letter. It is a clear and just thing, and my God has given it to me through many difficulties. Will, I believe, bless it and make it the seed of a nation. I shall have a tender care to the government that it will be well laid at first. So he intends to make it a beautiful place where it has fair laws and will be the seed of a nation, which it was. It's incredible, his foresight. Then he wrote a letter to the 1,000 or so people that were already settled in Pennsylvania. And he wrote, My friends, I hope you will not be troubled with your change. You are now fixed at the mercy of no governor that comes to make his fortune great. You shall be governed by laws of your own making and live a free and, if you will, a sober and industrious people. I shall not usurp the right of any or oppress his person. God has furnished me with a better resolution and has given me the grace to keep it. So luckily, God has touched me, has instilled in me this great desire, and has kept me from selfish purposes and desires. And all I want is to be a good governor to you and to make you as free and prosperous as you can possibly be. And then he writes a third letter to the Indians who also live in the area. He starts the letter, My friends, there is one great God and power that hath made the world and all things therein, to whom you and I and all people owe their being and well-being, and to whom you and I must one day give an account for all that we have done in the world. And he goes on, but I desire to enjoy it with your love and consent, when he's talking about Pennsylvania, that we may always live together as neighbors and friends. Else what would the great God say to us, who hath made us not to devour and destroy one another, but to live soberly and kindly together in the world? I am very sensible of the unkindness and injustice that have been too much exercised toward you by the people of these parts of the world, who have sought to make great advantages by you, rather than be examples of justice and goodness to you. He was really frustrated with the people who called themselves Christians and mistreated the Indians and took advantage of them and didn't honor them and didn't treat them fairly. He says, I am not such a man. As is well known in my own country, I have great love and regard for you and desire to gain your love and friendship by a kind, just, and peaceable life. And the people I send are of the same mind. I shall shortly come to see you myself, at which time we may more largely and freely confer. And in fact, when he finally did get to Pennsylvania, which took him longer than he wanted to, but when he finally did get there, one of the first things he did was meet the Indians that were there and build relationships with them. He went to the hard work of learning their language. It was a difficult language, but he made himself learn it so he could speak to them in their language. He paid them for any land that they claimed that the king had granted to him, and then instituted the government and the laws, laid the foundation for Philadelphia, called it Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love, because he wanted brotherly love to reign there. And not long thereafter, he was only there a couple years, maybe less. And then I think it was the governor or maybe the owner of some of the Maryland areas. And he told William Penn that he owned part of the land that was in Philadelphia, blah, blah, blah. And so he was going to fight it in the courts in England to get that land for himself. And when they tried to look at the charters they were given, they conflicted in the way that they outlined the property boundaries. And so this was the first big fight that Penn had for Pennsylvania. And he was in England several years fighting that battle. Years later, when he came back and he was leaving Pennsylvania again, the Indians gave him this beautiful tribute. Besides that he had paid us for our lands, which no governor ever did before him, and we hope that the great king of the English will be good and kind to him and his children. We shall have confidence that we and our children and people will be well used and be encouraged to live among the Christians according to the agreement that he and we have solemnly made for as long as the sun and moon shall endure, one head, one mouth, and one heart. We could say much of his good counsel and instructions, which he has often given us and our people to live a sober and virtuous a life as the best way to please the great God and be happy here and forever. But let this suffice to the great king and his wise sachems in love to our good friend and brother William Penn. They really did admire him and respect him and know what a good man he was. And after he established Philadelphia and left to fight for this land and came back years later, because of the laws that he had instituted when he was there and the way that he had treated the Indians and all of the things that he had instituted, he had the satisfaction of seeing Native American Indians and people of a dozen different faiths that I saw on one list listed of people that lived in Philadelphia in complete peace and harmony and did not give each other any grief. They walked side by side down the streets of Philadelphia. And it isn't coincidence that this is where the Continental Congress gathered, that this is where they wrote the Constitution. This was the seat of government, the place that had created the best laws in all of early America, and the place where the greatest freedom resided. Later on, when he was back in England and he had settled his affairs and he was ready to go back to Pennsylvania on one of the trips, he had the biggest betrayal of his life. Robert, who had put in charge of his financial affairs decades before, died. And not long after his death, his widow came to William Penn, and she waived a contract in front of William that William had forgotten about. Years earlier, when he was fighting for Pennsylvania and people were trying to take it away from him, his financial advisor, Robert, had come to him and said, I have a great idea. This is what we'll do. You sign Pennsylvania over to me unconditionally, and that way, if they take it away from you, then they won't be able to because I own it, and then I can just give it back to you. And if they don't take it away from you, then we'll just tear it up. And William thought long and hard about that. He trusted Robert implicitly. They had been doing business together for a long time. And so he decided to trust Robert and to sign this contract. And then the battle dragged on for years afterward. And because it kept dragging on for so long, William forgot about the contract. Robert never brought it up again. And when Robert wrote his will, he kept the contract and he left it to his wife. So she went to William Penn like she was not a nice lady. And she was just lording over him. And she was like, "Oh, look, I own Pennsylvania now, and you have to pay me 11,000 pounds for it, or I'm going to keep it and become the governor of it." William Penn just broke down. He excused this woman and he just wept. He wept because he was tired of fighting for Pennsylvania, and he wept because it was threatened again, and he wept because this woman was crazy and threatening to be the governor. And obviously, he didn't have 11,000 pounds to buy it from her, but he really wept, especially because of this great betrayal. Because the character of this dear friend and fellow Quaker was not what he had purported it to be all those years. He had deceived William intentionally and had been just a snake. And then, as they got into his books and looked more deeply at it, he got some advisors that helped him. It took him years to comb through all of the financials for all the years that Robert was with him. And some of the books were even lost. And they found that he'd been cheating him for years. He'd written himself contracts and given himself bits of land. He had basically stolen and cheated William Penn for a long, long time. Well, many more years of struggle lay before him, fighting this widow of Robert for Pennsylvania. He finally cleared that, and it was given back to him eventually, but not after a lot of heartache and headache. He did remarry again. His wife died, and he remarried. He figured he needed some help raising the two surviving children that he had, and then he married again. She bore him several children. Many of those died as well. And he was tired. He was now in his 60s. He just wanted to go back to Pennsylvania and rest. And he decided maybe the best thing to do was, instead of having the management of this kind of hanging over him, he would give it back to Parliament and they could oversee it. So he tried it. He said, "Okay, what if you guys take it back and I just go there and rest, live there the rest of my life?" Because he wanted to escape persecution by going to America. That's what instigated the idea in the first place. And he said, "But my condition is that you have to keep the laws I've instituted there." And Parliament was like, "No way. We're going to do whatever we want. If we're in charge of this land, we're doing whatever we want." So then ensued another battle. And finally, he just moved back to Pennsylvania to the property there. It was beautiful. It was a wonderful sanctuary for his family. It was about 20 miles, 30 miles from Philadelphia. He had his new wife and they had some children together. And he hadn't been there more than a few years, maybe two or three or four, when he had his first stroke. And he recovered from that one pretty quickly, but then not long thereafter, he had another stroke, and these strokes debilitated him to the point where he couldn't read or write or even take care of himself. And he eventually died in Pennsylvania of these complications. What's fascinating, though, is that, and I'm going to read you this part, because of William's stroke, the paperwork for the transfer of Pennsylvania to the crown was never completed. The Penn family retained official ownership of Pennsylvania until the time of the Revolutionary War, when all royal charters were dissolved. And frankly, I think that even that you wouldn't ever think that a stroke would be a blessing, but God used him. He used him all his life. And even when he made the mistake of signing this contract, he had a big battle ahead of him to retain ownership of Pennsylvania. But because he was a man with such a pure heart, with such perfect intentions, and no greed or selfishness really in his soul and heart, he maintained Pennsylvania through all those years. They maintained control. That meant that the laws that he put in place stayed in force until the Revolutionary War. And that kept Pennsylvania one of the freest places in the world. In 1751, a bell was hung in the Pennsylvania State House at Philadelphia. The bell celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Charter of Privileges that was written in 1701 by William Penn. The far-sighted framework of laws William Penn had put in place in his colony. The bell was inscribed with the words, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." And indeed, in 1776, with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that is what the bell did. The Liberty Bell, as we know it today, rang out to proclaim liberty to all those within its hearing. While William Penn, in the end, spent only a short period of time in Pennsylvania, in the time he was there, he left an indelible mark upon the place. And when a group of men gathered together in his city of Philadelphia in 1787 to draft a constitution for the fledgling United States of America, the ideals of William Penn from nearly 100 years before about liberty, justice, fairness, and tolerance guided much of their thinking and discussion. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson, one of the men present at that gathering, called William Penn, quote, the greatest lawgiver the world has produced. The legacy of William Penn's holy experiment in Pennsylvania had a profound impact on American religious freedom, making the colony one of the most religiously tolerant places in New England and the world at the time. His progressive ideas of religious tolerance directly influenced the framers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, embedding the principles of religious freedom into the foundation of American law. This enduring legacy set a lasting example for the future nation of the United States, demonstrating the importance and viability of a society based on religious tolerance and freedom. Penn's conviction that, quote, no people, and this is what is written in this Charter of Liberties, no people can be truly happy, though under the greatest employment of civil liberties, if abridged of the freedom of their consciences. This became the first provision of Pennsylvania's new Charter of Privileges in 1701. William Penn believed that good government could not be coercive, force of faith, or require conformity. An abiding respect for individual beliefs and self-government, he maintained, would bring peace and prosperity to Pennsylvania. And it did. And that peace and prosperity, as we know, went far beyond Pennsylvania, throughout America, and throughout the world. And these principles that he adored, and these principles that he loved, that he learned to articulate, and that he championed, have literally changed the whole world. So you and I owe a lot of the freedom that we enjoy today to this really, truly mission-driven great man. Now, if you're familiar with the 7 Laws of Life mission, you heard them all throughout William's story. But just to recap and demonstrate that he did, in fact, live those 7 Laws of Life mission, let's go through them. Number 1, loving God, establishing his divine center. Definitely did that. Lived those principles of building a relationship with God through prayer and putting scripture in his mind and heart and living according to it and being willing to obey God's laws. 100%. He was in prison and he could have gotten out, but he would not disobey his conscience, which he knew to be the voice of God in his heart, like Tolstoy said. Number 2, loving himself, striving for self-mastery. 100%. You can see all of the increasing levels of self-mastery that he went through, how he had to govern himself and rein himself in. And we can go through those principles, meeting his real needs. Yes, he made sure that he had the things that he needed, that he got the sleep and took care of himself the best that he could, and nurtured his spirit, his mind, his social and emotional needs, for sure. He lived the principle of managing his heart and mind, governing himself. And you can see I didn't give you a lot of details there, but the way in which he reined himself in and which he was striving to be more and more in control of himself as he grew. And then, of course, the third one, discovering and developing his talents. He was naturally very intelligent, so he was always educating his mind. He knew what gifts he had. He went to Oxford. He went to law school. He was a great writer, and he practiced his skills of writing over and over and over again in the service of people around him. And then loving truth, striving to understand principles and apply them in every area of his life. He was definitely tried to live according to his means. We saw how he scaled back so that he could help the Quakers because he didn't need the money when he was out of money then. In other areas of his life, relationship principles or governmental principles, we see that he worked hard to understand proper laws and freedoms. One of the things that I didn't talk about in the body of the story was a meeting that he held with other governors in the United States. They weren't the United States then, but he was the one that called the first ever meeting of different governors of these different areas and talked to them about how they needed to be unified, and that would help them to keep criminals within their territories, and they needed to barter and trade in fair ways. And it never came to fruition for several reasons, but he was so forward thinking. He understood those governmental principles so well, the economic principles and the religious principles and rights and duties. He definitely loved truth, was a truth seeker all his life, was mentored by multiple people, and he would bear the consequences of being trained by whoever he knew had truth to offer him, whether it was Moses or Thomas Lowe or Dr. Owens or other men and women and individuals that could help him. He was very devoted to having an educated family and leading in his home. And so definitely loving truth and loving humanity. He toured all through Europe. He came to know people of different faiths and beliefs. He loved them all. He wanted a place of refuge for them all. He didn't say, I'm going to go to Pennsylvania and make a place just for the Quakers. There were a dozen different faiths there and people that just believed in God, like the Native Americans, and they all lived in peace and harmony. And he was no respecter of persons. And he came to understand different worldviews, different religious perspectives, and he didn't expect other people to believe the way he did, but he expected them to honor the way that he believed. And he was definitely a servant leader. When he needed to work, he did, but then he spent his spare time learning from the Quakers and helping them. And then when he was financially independent, he used all his resources. And then he fought all those years, not to keep Pennsylvania for his ego, but because he needed those laws to stay in place for the people that were there. So he heard the call. He heard the call when he first heard the Quaker and he started to think about who he was and who he wanted to become. And he heard the call when he was at Oxford and he wanted to befriend other people and live according to his conscience. And he heard the call when he started writing tracts, even in prison. He heard the call when he was given the opportunity to be freed and he said, No, I'm a Quaker. He heard the call all the times when they needed his help, and he showed up as an attorney for them, or he championed their cause by talking to wealthy individuals or talking to the king or the king's brother, whoever he needed to do. He kept hearing calls, the call to be a husband, the call to be a father. And then, that biggest call of here's 45,000 acres. You're the richest landholder in the world. What are you going to do with this incredible gift you've been given? And he called it his holy experiment, and he consecrated it to God, and he gave it to the people that lived there. He really didn't ever make any money. He tried to collect rent so that they could have a government, and he put some laws into place, but he wanted to make sure that those principles of religious freedom and self-governance were in place and were never disrupted. And because of all of his hard work in England, he just wanted to rest in Pennsylvania at the beautiful home that he'd had built on the property that he had there. He only took a small little tiny bit for himself and had a garden built and a home. And he only spent a few years living in it because he was spending all of his time fighting for the people that he loved, being a true servant leader to them. He courageously executed over and over again. I mean, can you be more courageous than saying, this tower, this prison will be my grave because I will not recant on the things that I've said and the things that I believe. And then he did it again and again and again. So we can see those 7 laws in his life. They're always present in the lives of people who have a profoundly positive impact on the world, on others, on their family, and who don't leave their family behind and who don't leave their friends behind, who don't betray others and don't step on people to get what they want, who do it in the proper way and have a tremendously positive impact. And the reverberations of the sacrifices that William Penn made in just the 68, 9, 70 years that he lived on earth have lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. And you and I are still reaping the benefits of the arguments he made for the right of conscience and the laws he put in place and the unity that he strove for in America. I loved sharing his story with you. I hope it's inspiring to you. I hope it makes you want to Pursue your own life mission with a little more vigor and a little more intention, and find ways that you can discover your own gifts, that you can lay them at the feet of God, that He can partner with you to help you to fulfill your own life missions in His name and have a positive impact in your home, in your community, and beyond. Thank you so much for being here today. Again, if you want to understand these 7 laws of life mission in a deeper and more profound way and see it in the lives of the Ten Boom family, go get the Mission Driven Life audiobook for free and listen to more mission driven stories on this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me and listening all the way through, and I will see you next time.